listener production.
Hello, welcome to Monday and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. It's been 3 years since we last voted in a federal election and a lot has changed since then, especially our love or maybe our tolerance for the major political parties. So where do the Greens fall amongst this? Have the independents stolen their thunder and are we about to see all their political momentum come to nothing when we go to vote in the not too distant future?
My view is I think the more third voices that there are in Parliament, the better it is because issues get put on the table that otherwise wouldn't be there.
I speak to the leader of the Greens, Adam Bandt, in the second half of this episode. But first, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru on Monday, February 17.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody, and happy Monday. A new Productivity Commission report out today is shining a light on what's holding young people out of Australia's property market. Well, the answer is that the country is building half as many homes per hour worked as it did in 1995. The Commission is now calling for faster approvals and fewer regulations, with the research showing the average time to build a detached house climbed to 10.4 months, up from 6.4 over the last decade. And in the same period, townhouse builds increased to 12.9 months from 9.4, and the construction time for a block of apartments surged to 27.8 months, up from 18.5.
So, essentially, poor productivity in the sector means there are less properties entering the market, and that's making houses more expensive. The Commission's chair has made the point that if you lift productivity, there'll always be new homes, and that is regardless of what is happening with the workforce, interest rates, or costs. So, it's not the whole issue, but it is a huge part of the issue that is making housing so expensive in our country. And look, this comes at a crucial time for borrowers, with all signs pointing to yes for a rate cut tomorrow when the RBA meets, and it would be the first cut in 5 years. And the government will be hoping for that outcome too, with Labor needing an economic win as we draw closer to the election, because we know cost of living is going to factor very highly on people's priority list when they cast their vote. And yesterday, the party announced a policy to ban foreign investors from buying existing homes for the next 2 years, which is a copy of a coalition policy announced last year.
But there are questions about how much of a dent this will make in Australia's housing crisis. Foreign investors are already barred from buying existing homes, but there are exceptions for people moving to Australia for work or study. It's believed this policy will capture less than 1% of the current housing market picture, but it's been described by Labor as an important piece of its agenda.
Yeah, we'll see. Hey, look, I just want to quickly say, in case you were waiting over the weekend, because we talked about it on Friday, no, Albo did not call an election.
He did not.
The wait continues. But what did happen over the weekend was the release of this massive YouGov poll, which surveyed 40,000 Aussies about who they're planning to vote for this year. Now, it's not seen as a predictor of the result, but rather it emulates. So they survey this group of Australians and then they replicate how that might play out in each electorate. So what that does then, it gives you a picture of where the seats are going to go. So according to this YouGov poll, Peter Dutton has firmed as the narrow favourite to be the next Prime Minister of this country, but there's a chance he'll be presiding over a hung parliament. And that's because, according to this survey, the coalition would likely win around 73 seats. Labor would hold about 66 and lose 15 to the opposition. Now, you need 76 seats to form a majority government, so Dutton would need the support of the crossbench to do that. And he would likely get that if his party won the majority of seats over Labor. However, I did talk to Adam Bandt about whether the Greens would support Dutton should he win a majority. So listen to the deep dive coming up later in this episode to hear what he had to say. But yeah, some really interesting results out of that YouGov poll.
Talks to end the Ukraine war are expected to take place this week in Saudi Arabia, with the US and Russia in attendance, but not Ukraine, early reports suggest. It comes just days after Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had a 90-minute phone call, the first known contact between a US and Russian president in more than 2 years. While little is known about the exact details of that conversation, it is understood both agreed to start negotiations to end the war. Now, a delegation of Trump's closest foreign policy advisors including newly appointed Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, will be touching down in Saudi Arabia for the talks with their Russian counterparts.
Overnight, though, there have been reports that a delegation from Ukraine has not been invited. That's yet to be confirmed, but we know Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky wants his country at the negotiating table.
I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never. And our people, never. And our adults and children and everybody. It can't be so. This is the war in Ukraine against us, and it's our human losses.
So that audio is from an NBC interview with the president that was released overnight, which is interesting timing considering these reports coming out that Ukraine's not going to be at the bargaining table. And look, this position that Ukraine is taking, that we won't accept anything without us being there, is something that the EU is backing. French President Emmanuel Macron calling an emergency meeting that's happening tomorrow. So according to a statement from his office, the heads of government of a bunch of European countries, including Germany, the UK, Italy, Poland, Spain, are expected to attend, and there'll be other EU and NATO leaders in attendance as well. And look, the main fear is that the White House could strike a deal with Russia that would threaten European security. And that's a fear that is not being alleviated as Russia continues to strike Ukraine, the latest leaving 100,000 Ukrainians without power in the country's south.
And just returning to that NBC interview with Zelensky, it was really interesting because he spoke a lot about not wanting to give up Ukrainian territory, which is an idea being floated around. He was also asked about how important US support is to the Ukraine fight. And that was something that he said is pretty much integral to their war effort and as well these peace talks. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it all shakes up. His biggest warning was to the wider European countries, especially the former USSR countries. So think countries like Lithuania and Georgia. Those are countries that were formerly part of the USSR. He says that they're also in Putin's sights. So if they let Ukraine fall over, similar things could be happening. Or if they give up a little portion of Ukraine, this will give Putin that go-ahead to, claim further territorial gains in other parts of Europe. Interestingly, Marco Rubio came out to say that one meeting is not going to solve the war. So while there are negotiations between the US and Russia, he said that this is just triggering a formal process of things that will come. He said that Ukraine has not been purposefully excluded from negotiations in general, however, has not provided a specific comment as to why they have not been invited to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, it does make sense. And also just a reminder, Donald Trump promised to end this war on day one in office. And 1 million people have been told to work from home today as train unions threaten mass disruptions in Sydney. Now, it's all amid an ongoing spat with the state government. We'll spare you the boring details, but what you need to know is that both sides have been locked in pay and conditions negotiations for months now. And on Friday, 40% of the workforce called in sick after the government threatened to dock the pay of any worker who engaged in industrial action.
Yeah, and that was a, sick day that they called into that caused over 90% of trains in Sydney to be either delayed or cancelled, I being one of the people affected. Similar action could happen today. The Rail, Tram and Bus Union says it's unsure how today will play out, but Sydney-siders who catch a train are being advised it might be best to work from home today rather than battle the potential commuter chaos. Sash, we can't work from home, so we're stuck here. I'm also someone at the mercy of the train network. This has been going on for so long and it is so frustrating. And I know anyone who's not from Sydney is listening being like, well, is it really that bad? I don't care.
Yeah.
Just for context, it takes me 20 minutes to get home on a normal train.
Yep.
It has taken me, with all this industrial action, up to 2 hours to get home. And it's not something that they're upfront about either. You could be waiting on the platform, waiting for your train to come by. It never comes. Your train gets delayed. Or you do get on your train and it stops at the next station and just chills there for 10 to 15 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah. And the train guards try their best, like they've been playing Snoop Dogg and like some pretty good tunes. But I'm like, this is not enough. This is not this isn't enough for me to be cool, calm and collected on our trains.
Yeah. Oh, look, I totally understand why people are frustrated. We did actually deep dive how unions are able to do this in a recent interview with Will Strike, and we'll pop that episode link in the show notes. Be sure to have a listen. But I wanted to look at what workers have achieved by striking, right? I just thought I'd just have a little dig around. So did you know that the first documented workers' strike happened in Egypt in 1170 BCE? MP.
Damn.
And it was over rations.
Oh.
Workers who were building a pyramid weren't getting their rations.
Okay, I like that.
But also the 8-hour workday is the result of an Australian strike. So this happened in 1856. Stonemason workers? What is the working verb for a stonemason worker? Anyway, they wanted 8 hours each of work, rest and leisure. And months later, employees and the government agreed on the 8-hour workday.
Amazing.
Without a dip in wages.
Yay.
And it didn't make its way to America until 1867. So we really did lead the charge there. Recently, of course, we saw the writer strike in Hollywood, which was in 2023 over AI and streaming, which lasted 148 days and disrupted a lot of TV shows, much to our annoyance. But the writers did get what they wanted out of that for the most part. So, maybe just think of the workers while you're sitting on that train for 2 hours today.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
Thank you. Good luck getting home.
Thanks.
Next up, it is our deep dive. It's my deep dive. I spoke to the leader of the Greens, Adam Bandt, basically asked him, what do the Greens do these days? It was a really fun but fiery chat. Make sure you stick around. In 2022, the Greens had their best federal election result ever, picking up 12 Senate seats and 4 in the House of Reps. To put that into perspective, in 2019, they won 9 in the upper house and 1 in the lower. The vote 3 years ago was dubbed a green slide, with the party, along with the Teal independents, enjoying a surge in support from the Australian public, which was increasingly becoming frustrated with the major parties. Fast forward to last week's by-election result in the Melbourne seat of Prahran, which saw the Greens lose it to the Liberals after holding the seat for over a decade. That same weekend, another by-election happened in Werribee, also in Melbourne, and there was a big swing away from Labor. Typically, the minor party should have benefited from that, but it didn't, recording a meagre 0.7% increase in first preference votes. All of this is to say the Greens have failed to maintain the momentum they had in 2022. Recent polling gave them their worst result in 9 months, and their leader Adam Bandt is failing to cut through with voters. So what happened to the Greens? Can they recapture the attention of Australian voters? And is it time they change their approach, especially as we count down to the next federal election? Who better to ask than Adam Bandt himself? Welcome to the briefing, Adam. Thanks for being here. Look, 2022 was such a massive year for the Greens. Do you feel like that momentum you had, you were nipping at the heels of the majors, you won the most seats you ever had, do you feel like that's dissipating?
No, I think the 2025 election is going to be really a once-in-a-generation chance for a lot of people to get some real action on some of the big crises that are facing us. The commentators are saying we're likely to have a minority parliament, so neither Labor or Liberal has a majority. The Greens are on track in seats right around the country to win additional seats if people respond to us and come out and vote for us. And that means it's going to be a really unique opportunity from our perspective to keep Peter Dutton out, but also to get Labor to act on the big crises that we're facing. And our plan that we've been rolling out over the last few months, which is to tackle the housing and rental crisis, tackle the cost of living crisis, fund it by making big corporations pay their fair share of tax so that we can do things like see the GP for free in this country and get dental into Medicare. We're getting a really positive response to that.
I'd question that though, because at the weekend in Victoria in Melbourne, we saw the Greens lose the seat of Prahran for the first time since 2014. And in Werribee, your primary vote didn't increase at all when people were swinging against Labor. So how can you marry that result with the idea that the Greens are actually, the momentum hasn't dissipated and you guys are as strong as ever?
Yeah, I mean, during the course of last year, we got, for example, in Tasmania, a number of new MPs elected and got our best ever election result. And in the Northern Territory, we got a new MP elected. In Prahran, that you mentioned, we did hold the seat and then there was then a by-election. And what happened there was that Labor preferenced the Liberals, and we saw the Greens and the Liberals essentially get the same primary vote, and the Greens were trying to keep the Liberals out, but a former Labor MP backed by a former Labor Premier ran and preferenced the Liberals, and that got them over the line. But a lot of people, we have very strong primary vote. We're running on 50-cent public transport fares, which of course they've got in Queensland now, and we want to see roll out right across the country. People like that message, but look, yes, obviously we wanted a different result in Prahran, but our job's a bit harder when Labor and Liberal work together to try and keep us out.
I'm interested to know what your opinion of the Teal independence is, because 2022 looked like there was room for both of you. The Greens had, like I said, a very successful result at the federal election. So did the Teals. However, we're kind of seeing, there's suggestion that the Greens maybe aren't quite on that same trajectory. You disagree, but, there are pollsters who have that opinion. But the Teals seem to still be going pretty strong. Do you kind of feel like they've come in and maybe nicked a bit of your supporter base, your voter base?
Oh, no, look, I think the more voices that there are in Parliament, the better. And in many respects, they're arguing for things like stronger climate action that we agree with and that we've supported for some time. Let's stop opening coal and gas mines. So I think and we just come out of a vote in Parliament at the moment where you had the Greens and the Independents together on one side, and you had the major parties on the other. On the last day of Parliament, the major parties are ramming through laws to give themselves more money in electoral reform to try and disadvantage new voices coming into the Parliament. And so in many respects, on a lot of things, yes, there's issues that we'll disagree with, but we also find ways to cooperate, and there are a lot of areas of commonality. And my view is, I think the more third voices that there are in Parliament, the better it is, because issues get put on the table that otherwise wouldn't be there. But I think one of the things that probably carves us out, marks us out, I guess, as being a bit different, is that our view is that in a wealthy country like ours, everyone should be able to afford the basics, like food, housing, world-class public health and education. But it's not being delivered at the moment. And so what we're putting forward at the moment to deal with the fact that you've got whole generations that are finding it difficult to rent, let alone ever buy, people being locked out of home, it's tough to afford the groceries. We're putting forward a plan to deal with that.
Yeah, but the support probably doesn't quite exist to actually enact those policies. The Teals, the thing that they manage to balance well is that they have a climate focus, but they're also economically focused as well. Whereas the Greens, the criticism of the Greens is that they have these pie-in-the-sky ideas that, are economically irresponsible and also, in a lot of ways, almost politically impossible to achieve. So do you not see where the disconnect could be there for voters who see your plan and say, well, how are they going to achieve that?
Well, look, I know that's what our opponents say about us, but that's because we're asking for basic things like these big corporations to start paying tax. We're putting forward proposals to make price gouging at supermarkets illegal, right? Now, Labor and Liberal, like all of the others, they take donations from these big corporations. They take donations from the big supermarkets. And so, of course, they're going to stand up and say, oh, no, we couldn't possibly do these things. But many of the things that we're putting forward are things that are done in other countries. Things like 50-cent public transport fares, something that we pushed for a while, is now being done in Brisbane. Like, these are things that can happen across the country. Of course, we're going to have to find ways of paying for it, which is why we put forward a fully costed platform. We get our policies costed by the Independent Parliamentary Budget Office so we can say, here's how you can pay for it. Look, other countries that have lots of resources, for example, they put a tax on them and they use that money to provide services for the people in the country so that everyone gets a share of the wealth. And in Australia, we do a pretty bad job of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Look, I want to speak about, the issues-based politics, and a lot of the criticism the Greens have faced recently is around what the party stands for. And two examples come to mind: getting involved in union politics, and Max Chandler-Mather standing up with the CFMEU after they kind of said, well, we're done with Labor. The Greens kind of seeming to want to swoop in on that position that Labor had held since, its inception. And also the war in Gaza. Now, both issues, while, are important to people, I think a lot of voters would feel that they don't go to the heart of what's important to their day-to-day lives, which is cost of living as the main one, really, things like housing and groceries, as you've mentioned. So do you think you've gotten lost in the weeds there and you've kind of lost sight and you're not reading the room properly when it comes to the big issues and what you want to focus on?
Well, in terms of what we are focusing on, as I said, like our platform this election is based on making sure that everyone in this country has what they need to live a good life. It is about focusing on the cost of living and the housing and the rental crisis, and we've got plans to deal with that. The last time we were in a minority parliament, which is back in 2010, the Greens used our position to get dental into Medicare for kids, right, and deliver something that really has made a difference to 3 million families around the country. And that's what we want to do. Like now, we want to get back in and finish it off for everyone. Like it's ridiculous that you can't use your Medicare card at the dentist, but you can for other parts of your body. And so they're the things that we'll be putting on the table, and that's going to be the focus of our campaign. As to the war in Gaza, look, we just took a principled stand, which is that there shouldn't have been an invasion, and because it was going to lead to the deaths of far too many people, and we want to see peace, and we're going to continue to push for a peaceful resolution.
I want to pick up on something you just said with the minority government in 2010 and, talking about the Greens being able to use your position to enact policies that you'd platformed on and that you'd campaigned on. Do you think you still have that power now? Because we saw last year when Labor was trying to get its housing policy through and the Greens took a stance that it wasn't going to support this policy. It ended up caving and now it's going through. What is the point of the Greens in the modern political landscape if you can't achieve that? You're not forming majority governments. So what do you guys do?
Well, we got $3 billion extra for public and community housing as a result of yes, having to put some pressure on the government, but our view was that in a context where rents are soaring and house prices and mortgages are soaring and people are struggling to just afford a roof over their head, we wanted the government to take the housing and rental crisis seriously. And they had these small target policies that tinker around the edges. And we were trying to, say, look, you've got to take this seriously. It's bigger than just a small target tinkering around the edges Band-Aid approach is going to fix. There are some big underlying problems in Australia around the housing crisis. We haven't been building enough public and community housing. We're still giving $176 billion as a country in tax handouts to wealthy property investors that are denying renters the chance to buy their first home and tilting the playing field against them. We pushed the government, and look, I accept pushing isn't always pretty, but on an issue as critical as this, where people can't afford a roof over their head, at the end of it, not only did the legislation get passed, we've got $3 billion extra for building new public and community housing that was never on the table before. So that's thousands of homes, right, that as a result of Greens' pressure are now going to be built. We've actually achieved a lot in this parliament. We've got people the right to disconnect outside of working hours. We've got reforms into our environment laws to protect our water. We've achieved a significant amount, and we've worked cooperatively with the government to get a lot of legislation through. But yeah, from time to time, we have had to push them to get extra results for people.
Would you form a minority government with Labor should it come to that this year?
Well, certainly wouldn't support Peter Dutton. We've made it clear that if the Australian people do choose a parliament, which the commentators are predicting is going to be a minority parliament, we would keep Peter Dutton out, and we want to get Labor to act.
I want to talk a little bit about likeability. Now, I'm sure you saw the poll in November last year that rated you the third least likeable politician behind Lydia Thorpe and Pauline Hanson, who you could argue are very polarising, let alone unlikable to many sects of the Australian community. Do you think a change of leadership might help the Greens get over the line more in 2025?
Yeah, and I think they ran a follow-up over the summer that, if I recall correctly, said that when you look at it over the whole year, Anthony Albanese comes out, behind me. So I think you've got to take some of these things with a grain of salt. I think at the end of the day, though, people want to know what, as a political party, when you get elected into parliament or an independent, what are you actually going to do to deliver to make people's lives better?
We often dehumanise politicians, but you are human beings at the end of the day, shocking as that might sound to some people. Did it hurt your feelings to hear that you were rated as the third least likeable federal politician behind people like Pauline Hanson and Lydia Thorpe?
Look, as I say, that's you got to take these things with a grain of salt. And as I say, another one came out a month or two later that showed a very different result. So I think you just got to take these things with a grain of salt. Like at the end of the day, it's like, I think people rightly want to run the ruler over everyone who's running for office and say, well, what are you actually going to do? Have you got a pathway to get it done? And for us, we're saying very clearly, well, our priorities, because we don't take donations from the big corporations like the others do. So we're actually in a position, and part of the reason I think that you're seeing so many third voices, Greens, Independents and others in Parliament, is that people have been looking at, I guess, the major parties and saying, well, you're not actually tackling the big issues, right? You're not tackling the big issues. And at the end of the day, rather than fake personality fights or confecting a conflict about something that is actually quite minor, why don't you just go in there and tackle the big issues? And I think at the end of the day, that's what we're going to put forward at this election, and going to continue putting it forward front and centre and say you've got a once in a generation chance to make some of these things happen.
We did a recent poll ourselves here at The Briefing asking our listeners, and admittedly it was off the back of a chat with two independents, so that might have skewed the results slightly, but we did ask our listeners, where is your support going to go in 2025 at the federal election? And a huge chunk, a majority, said that they didn't want to vote for one of the major parties. I'm keen to hear what your pitch is to our listeners who might be looking at their local Teal independent going, you know what, they feel like a better option for me than the Greens, or, another independent who they feel is going to be more responsible economically than the Greens might be, but still focus on climate change. How do you pitch to those voters who might be looking elsewhere to stay with you and to vote for you this year?
Well, I think it's right. We can't keep voting for the major parties the same way and expecting a different result. We've seen what the major parties are delivering. It's a cost of living, and it's a climate crisis, and it's a housing and rental crisis. And this election, the Greens are putting forward a costed plan that will make people's lives better, and that will mean that everyone in this wealthy country of ours will have the basics they need to be able to live a good life. Things like world-class health and education, but also housing and food that people can afford. In a wealthy country like ours, everyone should have what they need. And we've got a costed plan to be able to achieve it. And we've got the runs on the board for showing that we can deliver. And I think this election is probably the best chance in a generation to get that kind of action.
Adam Bandt, you're a busy man. We appreciate you making the time to talk to us here at The Briefing. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
That was Greens leader Adam Bandt speaking with me there. Now, I want to make a note that here at The Briefing, as we head into the federal election, we are looking to bring you more interviews with our political leaders. And Adam Bandt is the first cab off the block. We have got requests in with Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese. We will keep pushing, and we hope to bring them to you soon. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share it with someone who you think might want to hear what Adam Bandt has to say. And please also don't forget to check us out on socials. We're on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Catch you next time.
Listener.